So raise your hand if you would have rather hear Brian rap. I think he should have given it a shot anyway. I've tried to sing for you, and that's probably just as bad, so, yeah. Anybody know why Adam and Eve got kicked out of the Garden of Eden? I mean, we know that, right? It's pretty clear in our minds. But when you talk to this new generation, they don't know that. They think Adam and Eve got kicked out of the Garden of Eden because they didn't read Apple's terms and conditions. How do we educate them? I don't know. There was a rabbi by the name of Lawrence Kushner. He wrote a book called Jewish Spirituality. And in that book, he points out that in the time of Jesus, there was no such thing as having a spiritual life. If you would have said to someone, how's your spiritual life? They would have looked at you funny because everything was considered spiritual. In fact, there's no Hebrew word for spiritual because there was no need for it. If everything's spiritual, you don't have to have a word that designates what is and what isn't spiritual. Now, I got to tell you, that's not how the world thinks today. Most like to compartmentalize things, to keep things separate from one another. We here like to say separation of church and state a lot. Many want a spiritual drawer, and they want a financial drawer, and they want a political drawer, and even a sexuality drawer. They want to keep things organized. No cross-contamination. Everything has its drawer. Everything has its place. And they certainly don't want it to all get designated as spiritual. Oh, let's pack it all into the spiritual drawer. Got to keep it separate. And we might feel this tension when we come to church, when we feel like someone is kind of digging in one of the drawers that the church shouldn't be in. Maybe we get a little defensive when Jesus gets talking about something that's not really in your drawer to dig, Jesus. But what we find in the gospel is that everything is spiritual. That Jesus is somewhat the dresser where all the drawers fit. But it's hard for us, though. It would be like me saying that, well, I just want to tell you I'm a vegetarian. Now, most of you are already going, yeah, right. But I'm a vegetarian except for bacon and steak and fried chicken. Now that makes a little more sense to you, huh? But that's not how it works. Other vegetarians are going to get mad at me for saying I'm a vegetarian, but I still eat bacon, steak, and fried chicken. Now, they're probably too weak to do anything about it. You know, that lack of protein and all. That was supposed to be a little bit funny. You could laugh a little bit there. That was my shot at the vegetarians. But sometimes that's what we try and do with our faith. We say, I'm following Jesus except for this, and except for this, and except for this. Someone once told me that they were a Christian and they followed Jesus except for that turn the other cheek stuff. And then they told me that was BS. But Jesus is going to dig through some drawers here. If you want, you can turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Remember, we're talking in the Sermon on the Mount. Last Sunday, we looked at some mountain teaching, the things Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. And we looked at some areas of our lives and we hold them up to the gospel. We hold them up to his teaching. It helps us to align our lives and teaching with the Master. Now, maybe the Sermon on the Mount could have also been called God's dream for your life. And I think you'll find that God's dream for you and the American dream are kind of on a collision course. Jesus started in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21. And he's going to use a phrase, a refrain, to talk about 6 different areas of your life. Matthew 5:21 starts this way. It says, "You have heard that it was said." You have heard that it was said, And 6 times you'll hear Jesus say this, and then he'll give 6 different examples of what he's clarified of his teaching. We won't look at all of those this Sunday, but I'd like to get started on some of those. And please know, you have heard that it was said was a common rabbinical phrase. A rabbi would say that, and then they would quote something from the Old Testament law. And each time Jesus uses this phrase, he's going to follow it up with the refrain. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Verse 22 says, but I tell you. Ooh. But I tell you, you have heard that it was said, but I'm going to tell you something else. You know, the way you were brought up, you've heard that it was said that that was okay, but I want you to think this. The church that you were brought up in said this, but I want you to consider this. So Jesus is going to take something that is commonly understood and widely agreed upon, and he's going to challenge us. Here Jesus is not going to contradict the law at all, but he's going to clarify it so we can see better. He's going to give us a deeper meaning or intended purpose of the law. So we'll look at these different examples, but first, I want to talk about 3 misconceptions that these examples are pointing us to. These are larger misconceptions that are all addressed throughout the Sermon on the Mount, and they're different from what the gospel teaches, so we can learn from that. And here's the first misconception. Some of you have heard it said, keep up appearances. Some of you have heard that. That may have been in the church where you grew up. Because as long as what other people see is okay, then you're okay. So you come on Sunday and someone says to you, how are you? Steve, how are you? And there's 2 answers, good or blessed. That's your 2 options. Scott, how are you today? Not fine, it's good or blessed. You're either good or blessed. You got to pick one of those and go. And many people think Sunday worship is all about keeping up appearances. And it wasn't okay for families who were struggling. It wasn't okay to let anyone know that you had some doubts, maybe you had some personal challenges. It was about keeping up appearances. Now, we do a really good job here at prayer time with sharing, and Brian in his communion meditations, many times, he says he's not good or blessed. We're here for each other to bear one another's burdens, to bear one another's personal challenges. Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 5, of the Jewish leaders, he said this, everything they do is done for people to see. Everything that those guys do is done for people to see. Appearance was everything to them. They turned the temple into a fashion show where people were judged by what they wear. They turned prayer into performance where the longer you prayed, the more spiritual you must be. They turned faith into a competition where they're constantly trying to outdo each other. Because I have a lot more faith than you do. They've turned the clergy into that as well. Oh, I'm a Pharisee, so obviously I'm much better than you are. Jesus said everything they do is for men to see. And then he said in another place in Matthew, he said, but their hearts are far from me. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. The religious leaders were all about being polite and appropriate. And Jesus would sort of push their buttons at times. So you read about Jesus not washing his hands before he eats. Why? Because the religious leaders made such a big deal of it. And Jesus wanted to teach them what was important, and it wasn't ceremonial hand washing. – Really? Hand washing? So we need to choose genuine and authentic over appropriate and polite. And we got to do that every time. You have heard it was said, it's all about keeping up appearances. But Jesus adds, I tell you, it's about being authentic. Here's a second misconception that these examples from the Sermon on the Mount are going to point out to us. Similar but different. Some of you have heard that it said it's all about behavior. In the first century, you had these Jewish leaders, and they took the law of Moses and they turned it into this giant behavior handbook. And the emphasis was on behavior rather than the heart. And you know, sometimes we go that way as well. When we make New Year's resolutions, we put the emphasis on the habit, not the heart. What Jesus is going to do with these examples as we study the Sermon on the Mount is he's going to drive home the fact that it's all about the heart. Everything flows from the heart. Jesus puts it this way in Mark 7:21. He says, "For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder." Verse 22, he adds these: adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. Jesus is saying that stuff comes from the heart. He's going to take our focus off of the habits and put it towards the heart. Maybe think about it like this. You're lying on the couch one evening watching TV when a drop of water comes from the ceiling and it hits you in the face. And before you can react, another drop comes, and then another. And there's this stream of water coming now, and immediately realize just what has happened. You left the sink running in the upstairs bathroom and had the drain plugged. So what do? Here's what you could do. You could run into the kitchen and grab a whole roll of paper towels and run back out and begin wiping up the water. And you could try and clean up the mess. And you have to run for more paper towels because there's a lot of water and it keeps coming. You could do that, but that's not what you do. What you do is you go upstairs and you turn off the water and you pull the plug and then you clean up the mess. See, for a lot of folks, church is about cleaning up the mess. And you have gone through a ton of paper towels, and you know that's bad for the environment, right? That was supposed to be a little funny too. And you've gotten pretty good at cleaning up the mess, but it keeps on coming. And Jesus is going to say, go turn the water off. Everything flows from the heart. So let's examine the heart. He's going to put our attention on what's inside rather than what's on the outside. And here's one other misconception that comes out of these examples from the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus wants to draw our attention to this. Some of you have heard it said, some sins, well, they're not really that big a deal. That was common then, it's common today, this classification of sins. Because there's acceptable ones, but there are also unacceptable ones. In Jesus' day, the religious leaders would essentially draw a big circle around, and anyone who was guilty of the unacceptable sins, well, you had to stand in that circle. No, that wasn't a regular sin. That was an unacceptable sin. You go here. And the religious leaders would stand outside the circle and determine who had to be inside the circle of unacceptable sins. And the religious leaders would feel better about themselves because, well, I'm not in that circle with them. Because, in the circle, that's where the bad people are. They're inside the circle, but I'm not that bad. There are a couple different ways that determine if sin is a big deal or not. I find this in the world. If we can see it, if we can't see it, then it's not a big deal. If you sin and nobody saw it, is that really sin? It comes down to the if a tree falls in the forest thing and nobody hears it. If nobody sees it, is it really sin? And so if nobody knows about it, it's not that big of a deal. The other criteria would be, if I don't struggle with it, then it's not that big a deal. I can look at other people and see what they struggle with, but if I don't struggle with it, it's not that big a deal. I don't struggle with that, so you go in the circle. For the rest of us, we have some things in common and we're working on it, but ours are acceptable. Our stuff doesn't put us in that circle. So Jesus is going to give us some examples that it's not about appearance, it's not about good manners and being well behaved, and that every sin is a big deal. And hear this, in this passage what Jesus is doing is, he's widening the circle. To make sure you know and I know that we're in it. Matthew 5:21. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And we agree with the command, you shall not murder. I hope so. Anybody disagree with that? If you do, don't tell me because I don't want to know. If you meet somebody who says, yeah, I don't really agree with that, I think you should be able to murder, run. Just run. Anybody hear about the driver who was driving down the road and he picked up a hitchhiker? Yeah, the hitchhiker got in the car and he said, I can't believe you picked me up. How do you know I'm not a serial killer? And the driver said, yeah, what's the chance of having two serial killers in the same car? If you think the point of my sermon is murder is bad, don't do that, then we can all leave here feeling pretty good because I'm not in the murderer circle. I'm outside that circle. I haven't committed murder. And yet, here's what Jesus is going to do. He's going to broaden the circle. Verse 22. He says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Well, wait, Jesus. You just said if you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. Now you're saying if you're angry with someone, you're subject to judgment? Yep. And so is that a different judgment? Nope. And is that a different penalty then? Nope. And Jesus makes the circle a little bit bigger. The anger he's talking about here is selfish and prideful anger. It's the nobody's going to talk to me that way anger. He continues in verse 22. Again, anyone who says to a brother and sister, Raka, is answerable to the courts. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So, Raka is this derogatory term. It would be kind of like using the word idiot today. And then the word fool here, that's where we get our word moron. So Jesus is saying, if you have anger in your heart and you're expressing your anger to people in ways that are hurtful, then step into the circle. You're in the circle too. That's hard for us because most of us want to be good enough to be in the group outside the circle. We don't want to be included with those bad people. I can tell you I never murdered anyone. Good to know, right? Yeah, the preacher's not a killer. But I never murdered anyone. But I also have to tell you there's many times when I've become angry and I've expressed my anger in hurtful ways. And I yelled and I raised my voice and I probably even called names and I was certainly disrespectful. And even as I confess that to you, there's a problem. And the problem is that you and I kind of had this agreement with one another. Well, yeah, we kind of assumed all that, Steve. And that's probably true for me too. I've done that as well. And we kind of agree that it doesn't mean that you have to step inside the circle, Steve, because I do that too. And I'm not in the circle. And we're all kind of okay, right? Jesus isn't saying murder isn't that big of a deal. He's not saying it's just like getting angry. What Jesus is saying is anger is a lot more serious than you realize. And our tendency to dismiss it, that's a problem. We can't say, that's just how I'm wired. I grew up that way. Think of it this way. If somebody stabs another person, they don't say, I'm just a passionate person. Sorry, bro, that's just the way I'm wired. I didn't mean anything by it. My bad. No, there's an accountability that's required. And Jesus is saying the same accountability that is required in this outward act of violence is also required by what's in your heart, the anger that's in your heart. Some of us get angry and we don't call names. Those are the worst of the silent, angry people. We get silent and bitter and we take it out in a passive-aggressive way. I have a friend that when she gets mad, she has this tell. She says, I just think it's funny that, and what she's talking about, she doesn't think is very funny. In fact, she's ticked off. You don't want to laugh at the stuff she doesn't think is funny. She might say, I just find it's funny that you use me as a sermon illustration, because it's not funny. To her, she's angry. Passively, but she's angry. And we have these ways of expressing our anger that we filter. But inside, guess what? Inside there's anger and bitterness. Also, I wanted to let you know that I think culturally there has been a shift. We're more angry, and we're more angry more often. I saw a survey online, and you can find any kind of survey numbers online, but it told me that 7 out of 10 people say that they get angry every day about something in the news or on social media. Anybody get angry or upset every day about something they saw in the news or on social media? Informal survey. Come on, raise your hand. Yeah, I know. So I figured I would put this to the test. And I looked for a news story on the net that I thought nobody could be angry with that. So I found, can we put up the picture of the puppy? Cute puppy picture, right? And I thought, who's going to be angry with a cute puppy? And so I looked at the comment sections on this story. That's where the angry people live, in the comment sections. First comment is, why would anyone cram a puppy into a cup? That's what you get from this? Really? Somebody rammed that puppy into that cup. And he's pretty unhappy about it. Someone else wrote, hope he can get out of there before he starves. Really? He looks kind of healthy to me. I don't think he missed a meal. Here was my favorite. Someone wrote this. Kittens are cute, dogs are blah. Probably posted by one of those idiot dog lover people. Remember the word idiot? Raka. Relax, it's a cute puppy picture. But there is so much anger out there in the world. Ever see how when one person starts venting on social media that many others just join in? They call it the mob effect. Matthew 5:23 and 24. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Something really subtle here that maybe we don't always recognize, and it's significant. Jesus said, if someone has something against you. It doesn't say if you have something against someone else. That's different. If someone has something against you, you are the one asking the question, how has my anger, how has my bitterness caused pain to someone else? If someone has something against you, go being reconciled to them. You know, there's plenty of times when I know that someone has something against me. My mouth gets me in trouble all the time. And I say, well, that's their problem if they don't understand. They can get over it. And maybe that's true. But Jesus doesn't say go and be reconciled to them unless they should just get over it. Remember last Sunday we said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And in reconciliation, we model the gospel because that's what Jesus has done for us. And we have this potential for a powerful testimony to our whole culture. In this culture where everyone is angry, where we're the pursuer of peace, we live the gospel. Next area where Jesus addresses here is as an example is found in Matthew 5:27 and 28. Jesus said, remember these words, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So who is Jesus speaking to here? He's thinking of someone who thinks he's better than someone else who's in the circle. Folks, this isn't a sermon here about not committing adultery. We could do one of those if you want. Jesus is addressing the people who take the command to not commit adultery and want to put all those people in the circle and then say, you committed adultery and I didn't, so you're in the circle. Can you see how this is similar to murder and anger? Except here it's just adultery and lust. Jesus is following up with two very similar examples, so we learn a lesson. Maybe we have not committed adultery like the folks in the circle, but have we lusted? Jesus is again making the circle bigger. Adultery is not someone else's sin. Adultery is your sin too. And that makes us kind of uncomfortable because that puts us in the circle. If we lusted, then we're in the circle too. What's in your heart? Listen to verses 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gorge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Well, I guess that's pretty extreme, right? Like, is that literal, Jesus? No, obviously it's not literal. There's no example in the Gospels of people doing this in Jesus' day because of the way they dealt with people. What Jesus is doing here, he's saying is, this is a lot more serious than you think. And you should go to extreme inconveniences to deal with the sin in your life. Don't laugh at your sin. Don't shrug it off. Here's an idea. How about you repent of your sin? How about you give it to Jesus and you plug into the power of the Holy Spirit? As much as anything, folks, here's what this message is about. It is about self-righteousness. It's about maybe the most reprehensible sin to God. It's standing outside the circle and thinking you're better than others who are in it. Remember the example from John chapter 8? This is the story where the religious leaders catch a woman in adultery and they throw her at the feet of Jesus. And they put her right in the middle of the circle. And they say to Jesus, the law says that we're to stone her to death. What do you say? And Jesus widens the circle. And he says, if any of you is without sin, then let them cast the first stone. I read a story about this one time that Max Lucado wrote, and he said, "The sounds of stones plopping on the ground became deafening." We're really in trouble if we fail to realize that we're in the circle. And the only thing that saves us is being saved by the blood of the Lamb. See, if you're not in the circle, you don't get saved. Jesus came to save sinners. Jesus came to save those in the circle. And I'm in there. Maybe you too. He's the answer. As we sing our final songs, please give your life to him. That's the only thing that can ever save us from the circle. Let's pray.